But we begin the readout tonight with Happy Pi Day to you all. To those not in the know, it is the celebration of a mathematical constant, not the dessert. And here's another constant. It's also National Equal Pay Day, and women are still making less than men. Speaking of men who have an overinflated sense of self, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has finally shared with the world, or the roughly 3 million Americans who watch Tucker Carlson, what his policy position is on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. You see, Tucker, who just happens to be the favorite American anchor of Russian propagandists, asked a number of potential 2024 presidential contenders for their thoughts on the invasion and what they would do if they were president. Among Tucker's questions, should the United States support regime change in Russia, which isn't what the United States is actually doing, but Tucker never lets the truth get in the way. DeSantis responded by saying that the U.S. has many vital national interests. Becoming further entangled in a territorial dispute between Ukraine and Russia is not one of them. He also warned that escalated U.S. involvement in the Russia-Ukraine war would risk explicitly drawing the United States into the conflict, which actually isn't true. And it's also interesting, because back when Ron DeSantis was a mostly unremarkable Tea Party House Republican from Florida, he called on President Obama to get more aggressive against Putin. It's not surprising that he has changed his tune. He has larger ambitions now, and he's shown to be particularly adept at bogarting Trump and Tucker's talking points with his own uncharismatic panache. And here's the thing about those three men, DeSantis, Trump, and Tucker. When they see an opportunity to capitalize on whatever will trigger the right-wing id, they'll take it. Meanwhile, the people you might call the old-school Republicans, like Mike Pence, Chris Christie, and even South Carolina Senator Tim Scott, all responded to Tucker's questionnaire, calling for a more robust defense of Ukraine. Senator Mitch McConnell, who really hates being called Moscow Mitch because he blocked 2 measures aimed at preventing foreign interference in U.S. elections, has been steadfast in his support for Ukraine. Just a few weeks ago, he told the country and the MAGA wing of his party to wake up to the threat of Russia. Today, he got support from Senator and Trump caddy Lindsey Graham, who pointed out that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was a big deal and noted that the last time someone in Europe claimed the land of others and tried to take it by force of arms was Adolf Hitler's attempt to build a Third Reich. He also pointed out that Russia's claim to Taiwan is also based on the proposition of a territorial dispute. It's just so hard to keep track of Lindsey's beliefs, y'all. Sorry. Also, as if they need a reminder of what kind of actor Russia really is, earlier today, Russian jets harassed and then collided with the U.S. Reaper drone over the Black Sea. While Senators McConnell and Graham are fighting the good fight for Ukraine, the rest of their party has moved on. And they didn't do much to stop Donald Trump, who wants to leave the NATO alliance still if he's elected president again. Just look at House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. He has declined an invitation to visit Ukraine because folks like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz don't care for it. At this point, folks like Greene and Tucker have more sway over the principles of the Republican Party than Lindsey Graham or Mitch McConnell or even right-wing icons like Ronald Reagan. And they are letting the base's freak flags fly while they are dead set on peddling their brand of hate TV on Fox. The rest of the country has very different priorities, however. Take, for example, abortion. Republican lawmakers in South Carolina are considering a change to the state's criminal code that would make a person who gets an abortion eligible for the death penalty. Of course, the vast majority of Americans don't agree with the Republican Party on that. On guns, Republicans want to strip away protections that would make gun ownership safer. So when President Biden said this about gun legislation during an event announcing a new executive order to increase background checks, the majority of Americans agree.
Let's finish the job. Ban assault weapons. Ban them again. Do it now. Enough. Do something. Do something big.
And look at the push to censor books. Again, the majority of Americans support the opposite. Woke is a great word that triggers the MAGA mob, but it isn't what keeps most Americans up at night. Someone should probably tell Governor DeSantis, who has made turning the rest of America into Florida his priority, or forcing us all to live through one long, unbearable episode of the Tucker Carlson Show live from the White House for the next 4 years. Joining me now is Jelani Cobb, dean of the Columbia Journalism School and staff writer at The New Yorker, and Matthew Dowd, political strategist and MSNBC political analyst. And Matthew, I do want to go to you because for a time you were a Republican. And, I'm old enough to remember that Republicans had a pretty hard line against Russia at one point. They were the hawkish party. They were the party that said we have to take a firm stand against things like the axis of evil when it came to places like Iraq and North Korea. Trump fundamentally obviously changed that. He aligned the party with North Korea. He was friendly with Kim Jong-un. He's aligned the party with Trump. And you've seen this change in Ron DeSantis, who was going after President Obama, in his mind, for not being tough enough on Putin when it came to territorial ambitions. But then he changed. He ran for president. And he got money from the same people who were giving Trump money. This is this piece from South Florida Sun-Sentinel. Ron DeSantis had to return a political contribution that he received from two Soviet-born businessmen, Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman, who are accused of funneling foreign cash into U.S. elections to increase their influence and promote their business assets. We know that there was a guy named Jesse Benton who got 18 months in prison for funneling Russian money into Republican campaigns. Russians were all involved with the NRA. I could go on. But it looks like Ron DeSantis has decided to join their club. Your thoughts?
Well, yeah, you're exactly right. It's not long ago that Republicans celebrated Ronald Reagan standing up to the Soviet Union, and they constantly claimed by him being hard on the Soviet Union allowed or forced the Soviet Union to collapse, that they've gone off the deep end. I was thinking about your introduction about Pi Day, and the reason why this day was chosen, obviously it's 314, but it's also Einstein's birthday, right? Today's Einstein's birthday. And as I watched DeSantis and other the Republicans who want to replace Donald Trump and get past Donald Trump, I'll paraphrase Einstein. And Einstein would have said, you can't solve the problem of Donald Trump by using the same thinking that created Donald Trump, right? And what they're doing is they want to solve the problem of Donald Trump in their party by being like Donald Trump in their party, which to me is an amazing lack of strategy role in this. But what it really demonstrates, and this is why I think, as you have done in show after show, lift up the proponents of democracy, because what we have today is a Republican Party who sides now more with autocracies than they do with democracy, especially domestically in our country, in this place. And the more we can lift up those sort of people that are defending democracy, and as you laid out in so many different issues today, we have lots of reforms that we need to do in this country, lots of reforms, not to make it less democratic, but to actually make it democratic, because we have a democracy today that in many ways doesn't cede to the will of the voters. And that's why I think, to me, the more we can push back, obviously, against people like DeSantis and autocracy, but also simultaneously point out that, yeah, there is a problem in this country, not the problem the Republicans like to say, but the problem is that the will of the people are not getting heard.
Yeah, I mean, and to that, and this is a journalistic challenge. I'm so glad that you were here today with us, Jelani, because I hear in this business people talking about DeSantis in this very dry way that says he's different from Trump, that he is a turn from Trump, and that Republican voters want Trump policies without the Trump drama. They never specify which policies they mean, because Trump's policies were a massive tax cut for the rich. But other than that, it was attacking LGBTQ people, saying they shouldn't serve in the military. It was attacking Muslims. It was racism. The policies that seemed to get the right going were policies that were hate-based policies. And that's what seemed to make the right happy, because he hated the right people, quote unquote. And when it comes to DeSantis, this is his policy. I don't know anything. I haven't heard anything about dealing with the insurance crisis or his views on Russia and Ukraine seem to be just like Trump's. His ideas are to go after trans people, go after drag shows, stop the teaching of African-American history with any truth in it, promote this sort of Western essentialism in education, promoting now they're going to have a 6-week ban on abortion. The policies seem awfully fascist, just like Trump. He's just a meaner, littler version. So I don't understand how journalism is not able to wrap its mind around that.
Well, the interesting thing, when we talk historically, we had this phenomenon called McCarthyism in this country. And it was called McCarthyism because of the behavior of Joseph McCarthy. But if you look actually at that time frame, that time period, McCarthy was only guilty of seeing where the crowd was heading and running out to the front of it. That the phenomenon that we knew of as McCarthyism preceded Joe McCarthy, and it succeeded him. It continued after he was censured by the Senate. And so the same thing is the case with Trump and Trumpism, that the dynamics that we've placed his name on existed prior to his ascent, prior to him coming down that escalator in 2015. And, he has put an imprint on those things, or branding, which is what his talent really was. And so he's branded those things after himself. But the dynamics that created it, that allowed him to have that much success, continue. And, the best example of that is that when we look at the policies and the positions that Ron DeSantis has taken up and the way that they appear to be, so very Trump-like, he is responding to the same sort of pressure created by a right-wing media system in which any person who deviates from the standard orthodoxy can face a challenge, a primary challenge. And when you talk with political scientists, they'll tell you that the primary system here is one of the reasons why the party has moved so far in the authoritarian direction. People have leveraged it in that way. What we haven't done as journalists is outline the connections between these things to understand how we are seeing really kind of marginal and extreme viewpoints being mainlined into American politics via this particular mechanism. And that's why these things appear the way that they appear right now.